have you seen that the former Home Secretary Suella Braverman, she has written some quite strong words in the Telegraph. She, and this is a direct quote, says that the Islamists, the extremists and the anti-Semites are in charge now. Of course, this all kind of feeds back into the goings-on that we saw outside of Parliament, didn't we? And, of course, inside of Parliament, apparently MPs been intimidated into having to get a vote on the situation in Gaza. She also, Suella goes on to say, we need to overcome the fear of being labelled Islamophobic and speak truthfully. Mark Goodwin, where are you on all of this?
I'm Team Suella. I think actually what she's speaking is what she's sharing is a view that most people out there would agree with, which is that we have a radical Islamist minority that is emboldened by a radical left, that where you know, we look at the Mike Freer case, the MP that was basically leaving frontline politics because of threats from radical Islamists, whether we look at the actions this week in Parliament with the Speaker, whether we look at some of the very serious threats to the safety of British people, we have a very big problem here. And the Labour Party, what worries me about the incoming Labour government, if you believe the polls and we're about to have a Labour government, what worries me more than anything, Michelle, is actually that we have a party that pretty consistently caves to this sectarian interests rather than projecting what is in the interests of the wider national community. And that is where I really become quite cynical about this Labour Party and what it's really all about.
And what do you think it's all about?
I think it's ultimately about representing what it would call stakeholder interests, minority activist groups within its electorate, prioritising those at the expense of the wider national community. I don't think I've seen any frontline Labour MPs today, perhaps I'm wrong, but I haven't seen any frontline Labour MPs criticising what was projected onto the Houses of Parliament last night, the sort of disgusting images of, you know, anti-Semitism and the slogans and so on that were projected onto the side of side of Parliament. And I think the Labour Party is so invested in these sectional interests that it's not really speaking for the country at large.
Whelan, do you agree with that?
I do and I don't. The reason I don't fully is because I don't think this is just a Labour Party problem. If you look at if you listen to the debate on Wednesday evening and sort of paid attention to what people were saying, there was this really telling quote from a Tory MP, Mark Logan, I think his name is, who basically said, you know, we don't become MPs to fix potholes. You know, none of that. That's not important to us. We're here to save lives. He was an MP who broke with the party line to support a ceasefire. And I think it told you something about what Matt identified, which is that there is this desire to kind of use the Middle East as a bit of a stage for posturing, but also to sort of a sort of self-aggrandizement of MPs who are, you know, there is nothing that took place on Wednesday that will change the fate of any person living in Gaza. And there's a sort of unwillingness to face up to that I think is cross-party. In regards to Suella Braverman's comments, I think she's wrong to say they're in charge. I think she has a habit of trying to be inflammatory, which serves her own careerist aims, which I have no truck with and I just find pretty boring, to be honest. But what she's right in saying is that there is an unwillingness to address an Islamist threat. If you take, for example, there was a report out, I think it was a few weeks ago, about a month ago, from the Joe Cox Foundation, which was all about toxicity in politics and threats to MPs. I read it in detail because I wrote an article about it for Spiked, and it did not once mention Islamism. It did not once mention anti-Semitism. It did not mention anything to do with gender ideology. It was an absolute pile of nonsense. And that is the sort of view taken by a lot of MPs at the moment, which is just let's not talk about these issues, let's ignore them. Yvette Cooper was on the Today programme this morning talking about Suella Braverman's comments, and the Shadow Home Secretary of Labour. And when asked, you know, what do you think about this Islamist threat, given the fact that Lindsay Hoyle had essentially said, I've been told by the Labour Party, in as many words, that there are MPs who are being threatened, and I'm doing something about it. Yvette Cooper basically said there's nothing to see here. Which is, to my mind, gaslighting her own MPs, actually. So there's something very worrying.
It's gaslighting the country.
Well, yeah.
Well, there's something very worrying going on about the unwillingness to address Islamist terror. And I think it comes from a fear about being Islamophobic in part, also just as outright cowardice. And the reason why that's so toxic is we have to be very clear about making the distinction between the vast majority of Muslims who despise these actions as much as anyone else, and then the sizable number of extremists who are hell-bent in trying to convince people that death cults are the way to go and that the way we live is terrible. And I think that you can be very clear in condemning Islamism, very easily clear in condemning Islamism, though many people find it hard to do for some reason, and not be Islamophobic. That is a very easy thing to do.
But I'm tired of this conversation about Islamophobia. The Shawcross Review is very clear. The biggest threat to our way of life is coming from radical Islamist terrorism. It isn't coming from the far right. It isn't coming from extreme right-wing groups. The Shawcross Review is clear. It's coming from radical Islamists. And the reason the Labour Party don't want to talk about this, let's be really honest about what's going on, is because we have a belief system in this country, a kind of woke ideology that says minorities are good and majorities are bad. So the political class cannot ultimately bring itself to say a minority group has a significant problem within its own communities that it needs to get on board with, because that would accept, or that would be based on the premise that the entire narrative that they've been pushing for the last 20 years is wrong. The biggest threat to our way of life is not from the far right. It is from radical, violent Islamism. Let's call it what it is, and let's deal with that.
One of the things I found interesting in what Suella said, she says, we cannot allow teachers to be hounded out of schools because a picture of Muhammad was shown. She essentially says we can't allow children to be bullied because the Quran was scuffed accidentally. In this country, it's perfectly lawful to criticise any religion or God. One may disagree passionately, but it's not criminal. But I take issue with some of that, because when she says we cannot allow teachers to be hounded out of school, well, they have been. And what I found really interesting is that people are starting to pay attention in the here and now, and they're starting to go, oh, look at this, democracy is threatened because apparently they've had to put this amendment on the voting slip because there's been these threats towards MPs. But actually, we've allowed ourselves to get into this position because the second that you let a teacher go into hiding for his life, and nobody, even this letter says we cannot allow teachers to be hounded out, but they are.
It's not only that. We had an MP, Mike Freer, who left office because of threats from radical Islamists. Now, where was the Prime Minister? Where was the big statement outside Number 10? Where was everybody, decrying the fact that we have a Member of Parliament leaving public office because of threats from radical Islamists, alongside what's happened with the teacher in Birmingham? We have a political ruling class that is basically scared to call this what it is. Let's be honest about what's going on here. And that's the problem. Now, what the answer is, we need courage in public life. We need security. We need MPs to feel protected, to feel able to speak out. And we need our columnists, by the way, Michelle, many of whom have spent the last few weeks saying, oh, there's no problem here within British Muslim communities. The answer actually is in, student activists from the 1960s, and we haven't got any problem at all with multiculturalism. The reason Suella is cutting through is because actually what she's saying is that the problem here is directly related to our experience with mass migration and multiculturalism. I
know, but what she's saying is words. She is in a senior position of power. There's no point writing you can't allow teachers to be hounded out of school, because you've got a teacher that's been hounded out of school. So if you're passionate about not allowing teachers to be hounded out of school, you're in a position of power. You're in a position to affect that change. Get that guy, get him back into that school, put a ring of steel security around him, and send a message to the community and to these extremists, we're not having it. That's what she should be doing.
I agree.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Unfortunately, Suella Braverman does not have a freedom-loving bone in her body. During her time as Home Secretary, she was arguing for greater clampdowns on protests. She is even within this article, she's essentially labelling the entirety of the pro-Palestine marches as anti-Semitic and hateful and in need of being arrested. Now, you might disagree vehemently with a lot of what goes on those marches. Indeed I do, but I wouldn't for one second suggest that they should be illegal. In fact, there was actually quite a telling response from lots of parliamentarians to the protests outside on Wednesday. There was a big pro-Palestine presence outside the Palaces of Westminster on Wednesday when MPs were discussing these amendments, as you might expect, because it was a relevant issue. And there were lots of MPs suggesting that those people should be stopped, that they should even be arrested, that they were saying that there's now suggestions that buffer zones be put up not just outside MPs' houses, which might sound sensible, but outside public buildings and constituency offices. This is illiberal. This is a very, very wrong attack on freedom of protest and freedom of expression. So the reason why I think that we have to be careful in the way in which I think we have to be clear in the way in which we talk about this Islamist threat. It comes back to what we talked about at the start of the show, which is what British values are meant to be about: freedom, tolerance and democracy. And if we start to damage those three values by clamping down on free expression, and indeed by straying into the territory, Matt, of suggesting that an entire community of Muslims are culpable, are guilty, are responsible for extremists, that's a problem. Because what you do is what you do is you risk losing that argument around tolerance.
This is a really important point. Let's be absolutely clear. Freedom, tolerance, democracy. Okay, fine. Where over the last 2 or 3 months, 5 months, have the prominent British Muslim spokespeople been advancing those arguments in our national debate?
You're making a silence.
No. This is a really important point, because after October the 7th, we are at a civilizational moment where you are either projecting those values and defending those values, because freedom, the way you talk about it, is actually not going to get us through this problem. We have public institutions like the police that have been openly politicised. We have a civil service that is politicised. We have public institutions that usually we would expect to be neutral and objective, but have been very clearly, as we saw with the House of Commons this week, have been taking sides in this debate in a way that we all find to be quite uncomfortable and disturbing. So I'm sorry, the freedom, the loving talk, etc., it isn't going to cut it this time. If you abhor extremism and terrorism, you've got to stand up now and say why you abhor it.
The difference between you and me is I don't put freedom in square quotes. I think it's the most important value to defend. And I think maybe, Matt, you've given up on it a little bit.
Then let's all stand up and say why we defend it, including British Muslims.
Well, what I'm going to